Hello, and welcome to the Senior Care channel here on Roku TV. Thank you for tuning in. My name is George Roach. I'm an elder law and estate planning attorney with over 30 years of experience here in the state of New York. In previous programs that we've taped, and thank you for watching, we've talked about the importance of planning documents for senior citizens, such as a will, durable power of attorney, healthcare proxy, living will. Then we followed up with a program on how to finance long-term care, becoming eligible for public benefits such as Medicaid, and what the law allows you to protect and what you can keep. And it's a lot more generous than people think. Today's topic, we'll be talking a little bit about protecting that property. God forbid you pass away. We're going to be talking about estate taxes and a little bit about the importance of trust planning. Sort of simplify it for you if I can, take the mystery out of it. A lot of people, especially senior citizens, get very confused about the value of trust planning. People study American history, and one of the famous people that comes up all the time is Ben Franklin. And Ben Franklin has a lot of quotations attributed to him. A stitch in time saves nine. Good fences make good neighbors. And the one I use from Ben Franklin when we talk about estate taxes is, very simply, there are two things certain in this life: death and taxes. However, till somebody figured out that dying is a taxable event. All right? If you pass away, and let's face it, nobody gets out of here alive. If you pass away and leave more than a certain amount of property behind, the government, both the federal and your state government, get to tax you on it. So it's very important that people be aware of the limits after which government starts to tax you on this property. We in the legal profession, we call it a stealth tax, because you don't realize it after you pass away, but your heirs certainly do, the people who start to inherit your stuff, and all of a sudden they realize, hey, mom or dad didn't do any planning. And now we have to pay either Uncle Sam and or the state you resided in. We have to pay them an estate tax, also called an inheritance tax. People inherited property way back when. Right? But it's the same name for the same thing: estate tax, inheritance tax. Now, as you know, we have a dual tax system here in this country. We have Uncle Sam on the one hand, the feds, federal government, and we have your state government. In our case here, we have the state of New York is on the other side. And for those of you who have filed tax returns over the years, you pay the federal and you pay the state. All right? Some of you may have been fortunate enough to get a refund. But most of the time, you pay the federal, you pay the state. Now, last January, 2013, all right, a lot of talk was had. You turned on the news, watched the news programs at night, and everybody and his brother in Congress was talking about the Fiscal Cliff. We were all standing at the Fiscal Cliff, peering over, because we didn't know where these limits were going to be set. If Congress didn't do anything, they'd set very low. So it was incumbent upon Congress to do something, get their act together, and as you know and I know, Congress never seems to act unless there's a crisis going on. So it was enough of a crisis, so they finally gave us some definitive answers to where we stand on estate tax. As far as the federal government goes, right, the federal government set their estate tax limit at $5 million. All right, $5 million, and it's indexed for inflation, which means it presently stands at $5,250,000, or 5.25 million, which means if you pass away and leave more than $5.25 million, the federal government gets to tax you on it. Right? So what is the tax rate? The tax rate was set at 40%. Remember that number, 40% on the federal side. Right? So 5.25 million, that's the level you're at on the federal side. Now, most people say, hey, great, that lets me out. I don't have anywhere near $5.25 million. There's a wolf lurking in the woods. And the wolf, in our case here in New York, is the state of New York. Many, many years ago, when the federal government started bumping up the amount of property you could leave and not pay any tax, the state of New York, given the fiscal condition we're in, as in most states, said, look, we cannot afford to lose that kind of revenue for people who don't do the planning. So if you don't do the planning and leave a certain amount of property in New York, you are going to get taxed on it. The state of New York, many years ago, set that level at $1 million. All right? 1 million is the number here in New York. Now, it's 5.25 million on the federal side. It's 1 million on the New York State side. So if you're watching this program in another state, it would behoove you to check your state's state estate tax level. And you can simply, if you have access to a computer, you can simply Google Florida estate tax amount or North Carolina estate tax amount. And it's the information age. I'm amazed, even at my age, the amount of information I can get off the computer. So here in New York, it's 1 million. Now, if you don't have a million, you don't have anything to worry about. However, most middle-class people that I see in my practice, with the value of houses here in New York, an IRA, a second home, a boat, a car, you can very well be above that $1 million level real easy, and you don't even know it because you haven't taken the time to take stock of what you own. Start to add up the value of all these assets that you have. Now, if you look at the New York State estate tax chart, all right, it's graduated. It starts at $1 million. So if you leave less than $1 million, you don't pay any estate tax to the state of New York. Now, what happens if you were to leave an estate of $1,001,000? All right, you're $1 over the limit. Now, you go to the chart, the estate tax chart that we use, and you look and you see that the estate tax, the first $1 million passes tax-free, and the estate tax on $1 happens to be 41 cents. All right, 41 cents, 41 pennies. Now, doesn't sound like much until you translate those pennies into a percentage. 41 pennies of $1 is 41%. The federal government set their level at 40%. New York starts at 41% on that $1. All right? And it's graduated. The more property you leave, the less estate tax you pay, and the rate decreases. Okay? Now, if you look at a pretty good middle-class estate, let's say $1.5 million, $1.5 million, and I call this the $64,000 question. All right, you all heard about that show years ago on TV. Very simply, somebody dies, leaves $1.5 million property in their name. Okay, the first $1 million passes tax-free. The state of New York gets to tax them on the next $500,000. Well, what's the tax on the $500,000? We go to the chart, the estate tax chart. We look down, and lo and behold, down the column, over the row, the estate tax on $500,000 is $64,600. All right? So that's the $64,000 question. Now, I say to my clients and people in general, look, I would rather see that $64,000 in my children's pocket, my heir's pocket, than in the state's pocket. Can I avoid it? Can I reduce my estate tax liability? And the answer is yes, you can. All right? You do some very simple planning. You sit down with a knowledgeable elder law attorney in your state, and you should be able to reduce that estate plan. We do it all the time. We had a client came in just the other day. His wife had passed away, and what was he looking at? Well, we added up the value of all his assets, his home, his bank accounts, his CDs, everything that his wife had left him, because it was all held jointly. And by the way, as between husband and wife, if you are married, there is no limit on the amount of property you can leave to a spouse. And you do not have to pay estate taxes. There is no estate tax liability between spouses. However, the government is just waiting for that second person to pass away because they're going to be around. The government will be around before that. And what happens is then the government gets to tax you on that property. When husband and wife could have taken advantage of a little planning technique, and we'll talk about it later on, called a credit shelter disclaimer will or a credit shelter disclaimer trust to take advantage of that $1 million everybody has. But in this case, the gentleman's wife passed away. All $2 million went to him. He was the beneficiary. Now he comes in and says, all right, what's my estate tax liability? Well, he's got $2 million. Pretty simple. He did very well. 87 years old, all right, getting up there in age. Now, the first $1 million passes tax-free here in the state of New York. He doesn't have over $5 million, so he's not paying any federal. But the state of New York gets to tax him on the $1 million he has left. So we go down the chart very simply, and it's very effective when the client sees that estate tax chart. I hand it to him. I said, all right, go down to $1 million. Now go over the row and tell me what you see. And what he was looking at is $99,600. That's the New York estate tax on $1 million. And I said to him, would you rather see that $99,000 in your children's pocket, because he had 4 children, or would you rather pay it to the state of New York? He says, I'd rather see it in my children's pocket. I said, okay, let's consider how we reduce your estate tax liability. So in the short information I've just given you, I just wanted the audience to be aware of the limits. The federal, and that's no matter what state you live in, as I said, the federal is $5 million indexed for inflation, which is $5.25 million. And the state of New York here is $1 million. And of course, if you live in a different state, please check that state's estate tax limits so you know where you stand and you can plan accordingly. Now, a little bit about trust work we're going to use today. The use of a trust to reduce estate taxes and to reduce the amount of property that might be available should you need long-term care. I spent about 30 years of my career working for the Legal Aid Society here in New York, but I didn't do any criminal work. I was the chief attorney for the Legal Aid Society's Senior Citizen Division, which is where I developed my expertise in this area. But a lot of the clients that we had at Legal Aid didn't accumulate a whole lot of property. All right? So now that I've retired from the Legal Aid Society and gone out into private practice, I've seen clients who have a lot more assets and the strategies we use to protect them. And I have developed a real appreciation for the use of trusts, especially, we call it the gold standard, the use of the irrevocable trust in estate planning areas. It's the old saying, you know, you want your cake and eat it too. Well, the irrevocable trust fits that bill. Now, trusts oftentimes get very, very confusing to clients. All a trust is, legally, it's a contract between you and, of course, somebody that you feel has a moral compass, somebody you feel can follow your directions. Why? Because here's the word, we trust them. We entrust property to them. Most commonly, as a person who's a senior citizen has a child and says, I trust my child, I want them to wind up with the bank account. So the bank account is in the senior citizen's name in trust for the child, which means it's the senior citizen's money, it's your money up until when? When you pass away. All right? Once you pass away, that money is in trust for the child. That's when the child gets their hands on the money. It's in trust for them. They show up with their identification, copy of their death certificate, the bank book, and that's basically most people's concept of what a trust is. But it gets a little bit more complicated, but it's based on the same principle. Because you have somebody that has a moral compass, who can follow your directions, that's the person you choose to hold the property. Trusts have been around, believe it or not, historically, since the Egyptians. And essentially, it's a contract between you and somebody else to hold property and follow your directions. Conceptually, the way we explain it to many senior citizens, when you create a trust, essentially you're creating a box. That's all you're creating, a legal lockbox. That's the irrevocable trust. And what do you do with the box? We store stuff in the box. I say stuff, your property, your assets. You put things in that trust to protect them. All right? And what would you put in that trust? You could put your house in the trust. You could put bank accounts in the trust. Mostly anything except probably IRAs, anything, individual retirement accounts. Mostly any other asset you have, you can put in that trust. And that trust serves two purposes. One, if you should pass away, that trust passes the property on, and you avoid having to probate your last will and testament. All right? It's very private. It goes to the people you want it to go to. The court does not get involved, and it really is a money saver at that point in time. So your estate planning purposes are covered with an irrevocable trust. All right? Secondly, the property you put into that trust, all right, if it's in there for a period of 5 years, 60 months from the time you put the property into the trust, once it's in there, then it becomes protected. God forbid you need long-term care in a nursing home situation, or Medicaid, or Medi-Cal, whatever state you happen to be in, to pay for that long-term care in a nursing home. The transfers of property to that trust have no effect at all on your eligibility here in New York for what we call community Medicaid. Simply put, if you watched a previous program, for community Medicaid purposes, there are no transfer rules. There's no look-back period. So it doesn't matter who you transferred the property to, you can become eligible for community Medicaid. However, throughout the country, as a result of the Deficit Reduction Act of 2005, passed by Congress and signed by the President, the look-back period on the transfer of assets throughout this country went from 3 years to 5 years. It is a 5-year, 60-month look-back period on the transfer of assets throughout this country, should you want Medicaid to pay for long-term care if you are in a nursing home. So the assets have to be in that trust for at least 5 years. Now, there are many, many, many different types of trusts. There are just to give you some basics, if you create a trust in your will, your last will, it is called a testamentary trust. It's a fancy name simply for the fact that you created a trust in your will. The law, we like to give things fancy names. So that's any trust you create in your will, and that kind of a trust only goes into effect after you pass away. All right? And by the way, senior citizens often ask me, when is that? All right? And you are officially gone from this picture when the doctor signs off on your death certificate. That's when you're officially gone and considered having passed away. Not until then. So we have the testamentary trust. Any other type of trust that you might consider creating while you are alive, we give those types of trusts the name living trusts, solely because you created it while you're alive. Now, having said that, the types of living trusts that you can create are revocable, you can revoke them; irrevocable, you can still revoke them; special needs trusts for people with disabled children. You can create trusts to protect property from children who may have disabilities, may have an alcohol or drug problem, spendthrift types of trusts. Okay? The one most people are probably most familiar with in other states, especially Florida, is what they call the Revocable Trust. We call it revocable because once you set it up, you have the ability to revoke it. You don't like what's going on, you can cancel the agreement unilaterally and you get your property back. Also in a revocable trust, you can be the sole trustee of your own trust. You are controlling the property in the trust. And of course, the trust has beneficiaries. Most of the time, they're either a spouse, they're children, and when you pass away, those children receive that property from the trust. Who runs the trust? The people you name because you have faith in them, you believe in their moral integrity, you trust them. Those people are called trustees solely for that reason. They're the people who hold the key to the box. Right? Now, they can be one or two of your trustees, one or two of your children can be trustees of the trust. Now, the revocable trust, the one you can revoke, people create those types of trusts primarily for one reason, to avoid a probate situation, to avoid having to use your last will and testament, having to go to court, pay the attorneys, file a probate petition, being subject to objections to the will contest. So if you want to keep it private, people oftentimes create the revocable living trust to avoid a probate situation. And by the way, that is a perfectly legitimate legal reason for creating a revocable living trust. Now, there are two other situations people create revocable living trusts, and they are one where you have a family who is very litigious. They're going to sue each other. There's a lot of emotional baggage. They didn't get along throughout their entire lives, and they're going to run to court and they're going to sue over this. So what you want to do is avoid that situation. You create a revocable living trust, and you realize that it's very difficult to overturn a revocable living trust in a courtroom setting. All right? Much more difficult than it is to challenge a last will and testament and mount a will contest. The last situation you would create a revocable living trust is if you're sitting out there and you own real property in multiple jurisdictions. You know, you have your house in New York, you have the condo in Florida, you have this timeshare in Disney, you have a ski chalet in Vermont. If you own property in other states, you don't want to get caught in a situation of what we call ancillary probate, having to go to that state's probate court and get that property taken care of. Because let's face it, you may live in New York, but the property's not going to move back here. All right, you're going to have to deal with it in that state. So the trust, the revocable living trust, takes care of that. The trustees can give out deeds to people, and it's much, much simpler. But the main reason, as I said, is to avoid a probate situation. However, what most people don't realize about the revocable living trust, very simply, is it does absolutely nothing to protect that property. God forbid you need long-term care, either at home or in a nursing home situation. It's only good if you pass away. So the rule of thumb is very simple. What you want to remember is if you can get your hands on the property by revoking the trust, that is exactly what the Social Services Department is going to force you to do if you want Medicaid to pay for your long-term care. Hey, you have access to the box. Dip your hand in, get the property back, revoke the trust, and you spend it as if you hadn't done any planning at all, because you thought I was just going to pass away in my sleep and my kids will get the property and there'll be no probate, only you didn't count on the fact that you needed long-term care. So if a revocable living trust, one you can revoke, does nothing to protect the property in the long-term care situation, then what kind of trust does? And the answer is the irrevocable, or irrevocable, depending on which extent you put the syllable. The irrevocable trust is the estate planning vehicle where you can pass on your property and avoid probate and protect your assets from the cost of catastrophic illness. As we said earlier, you put that property, it's a lockbox, a legal lockbox. You put the property in there for a period of 5 years, 60 months, after which it is protected. Now, who are your trustees? Unlike the revocable living trust we just talked about, You cannot be the trustee of your own irrevocable trust. That's the first rule. You have to pick somebody else. Well, who do you pick? I would assume you pick somebody you can trust. All right? The children. Maybe one or two of them. Everybody knows their children. Who's got a good financial head? Who's not in bankruptcy? Who's not having marital problems? Those are the types of things you want to consider in choosing a trustee. Secondly, the trustees hold the key to the box. All right? But they have to follow your directions. And those are the directions we put in the trust agreement, all right, as to how they're going to deal with that property. If you put a house in, put your house in the trust, the irrevocable trust, it doesn't generate any income. However, if you put in properties such as bank accounts, stocks and bonds, mutual funds, annuities, if they go into the trust and they generate income to you, you still get the income. You pay the taxes on that income at your tax rate. Nothing changes. All right? Nothing changes. You don't want the trust to be paying the taxes at the trust rate. So you get the income, you pay the taxes. The only thing that happens when you create an irrevocable trust is that we retitle the asset in the name of the trustees. That's all. Nothing else changes. And you simply have your trust agreement, you waltz down to the bank, you show it to the people at the bank and simply ask them, please retitle this asset in the name of the trust. I'm doing some estate planning here. So you put your house in the trust. Now, one of the beautiful beauties of the irrevocable trust is, let's say you put your house in the trust. Okay? You're waiting out the 5-year period, and lo and behold, you decide, for whatever reason, I don't need this big house anymore. I would like to sell this big house and downsize. I want to rent. I want to buy a smaller house. I want to buy a condominium somewhere. All right? Your trustees, at your direction, have the ability to sell that house and buy you a smaller house, put it back in the name of the trust, and lo and behold, you do not interrupt the running of the 5-year period. It does not get interrupted. That 60 months continues to run even if your trustees sold the house and you bought a different residence and put it in that trust. You may sell the house, buy a smaller residence, put some cash from the sale of the first house into that trust. Doesn't matter. The 60-month period continues to run. All right? It's not interrupted, which is very nice. And the only situation you want to be aware of here is if you're sitting out there and you got to consider your age, at age 70, 75, 5 years can be a drop in the bucket if you're fairly healthy. The problem is if you start to push it up there to 85, 90 years old, sometimes it gets a little iffy when we're talking about a 5-year look-back period. Okay? Now, you're getting the income from this trust. Wonderful. And that's really what I wanted. If I die, the trust passes the assets on to my children. Good. Covers that base. All right? What happens after the 5-year period? Okay. After the 5-year period, the assets cannot be looked to by Medicaid should you need a nursing home. And by the way, they cannot be looked to here in New York for community Medicaid purposes because there is no look-back period. All right? So after the 5 years, you want some of those assets. You want to stick your hand in the box. Let's say you want to take a cruise around the world, one last hurrah on the Queen Mary. Okay, you simply direct your trustee, the children you named, to dip their hand in the box. And don't forget, the trustees, if their children, usually are beneficiaries. So they dip their hand in the box, and you need $30,000 for a cruise on the Queen Mary, they take that $30,000 out. Now, do they give it to you? Absolutely not. You don't want that money back. What they do is they take that money, that property, out the back door to the trust, and they simply buy you the ticket on the Queen Mary. Or they buy you the new roof that you need for the house, the new boiler, the windows. You can start using that property after 5 years. They take it out We call it an advance against inheritance. They're going to get it anyway, but they're taking it out for your benefit after the 5 years is up. Now, what's the control issue here for you? How do you maintain control over these trustees and these beneficiaries? Very simply, with each irrevocable trust that we do, the client gets what we call it the hammer. You're not going to remember the legal name for it. We call it the hammer, but legally it is called a limited power of appointment. A limited power of appointment. What's that? The limited power of appointment, or the hammer, simply means you get to keep the ability to change the beneficiaries if they do not follow yours, if they do not follow your directions. So if you have a son or a daughter who's a beneficiary, doesn't want to take the money out of the back door to the trust after the 5 years and make it available to you in some fashion, then you lower the hammer. You simply say, all right, you know what? I'm going to exercise my limited power of appointment and I'm going to change my beneficiary. I often say half of nothing is nothing. Your share just went to the Salvation Army, all right? Or another child, or the grandchildren, the children of that child who doesn't want to follow your directions. So that's how you maintain the control. And you'll find with that limited power of appointment, the kids stay interested. They send you Christmas cards, they send you holiday cards, they send you birthday cards, Mother's Day cards, Father's Day cards, because they want to stay in that trust. And that's the ultimate control. Downside, what's the downside here? The downside is you have to last the 5 years. All right? Sometimes people try to, they waited to whatever moves you at a certain period in time to start doing some kind of estate planning. Maybe it's because of an illness. They want to set up this trust and roll the dice and see if they can get 5 years down the road. Suppose they don't make it. Suppose they get 3 years down the road and now they are so sick they need a nursing home. They don't have the funds to run out the other 2 years, so we have to break the trust. All right? We have to break the trust. And here in New York, although it is called an irrevocable trust, as long as all the people who are beneficially interested in that trust are adults and competent, we can all agree to break the trust, okay, and get the property back. And we use a few strategies. We're not out of things to do yet, but if you don't make the 5 years, we can certainly give you a shot at saving some of that property. But as I said, you want to start doing this planning. The earlier you get to the table, the chess game, the chessboard to do it, the better off you're going to be. All right? And that 5 years goes by pretty quick. All right? One of the other strategies, by the way, is gifting. Okay? We talked about estate tax. What happens if you die and leave property behind in your own name alone? Well, if it was more than $1 million, the state of New York gets to tax you on it. What most people don't realize is here in New York, we have no gift tax. There is no gift tax in the state of New York. They can't tax you on giving away property. All right? Once you exceed the federal level of $5.25 million, then you start paying a gift tax to the federal government. But here in New York, there is no gift tax. Most people that I speak to are aware of what we call the annual gift tax exclusion. The amount of money you can give anybody, they don't even have to be related to you and not pay any gift tax. Most people say jump it to $10,000. Well, it used to be $10,000 a while ago. Now it got bumped up. So here in New York, the annual gift tax exclusion is $14,000. You can give any individual, related to you or not, $14,000 and not pay a penny in gift tax. Now, if I have $140,000 and I want to unload it, you want to be on my 10 best friends list because I can write 10 checks for $14,000 and not pay a penny in gift tax. The other side of that coin, very simply, is I can give the entire $140,000 to anybody I choose and not pay any gift tax. Why? There is no gift tax in the state of New York. So from my $140,000, I subtract the $14,000 that I'm entitled to give and not pay a gift, and the rest of the balance of that money, I simply give it away to one person and file a gift tax return, because then I'm just putting it on my tab, as they say. And my tab runs up to $5.25 million. All right? That's what happens. So gifting is a strategy. In the case we talked about before, the gentleman who came in, his wife had died and left him $2 million. The first $1 million passed tax-free. What did we do with the second $1 million? Essentially, we're gifting it away as quick as we can, and this way his children wind up with it, because if he dies with that tax, that $1 million in his name, he's subject to $99,600 in estate tax. If he gives it away, no $99,600 to the state of New York. All right, so gifting really is a viable strategy. And at 87 years of age, he's had it long enough. There comes a point in time where you've got to relinquish that control if you expect to protect the property. So trust planning goes a very, very long way in having your cake and eating it too, especially that irrevocable living trust. So we consider it to be the gold standard as far as estate planning goes.